2007 through 2014 Ford Edge rear wheel bearing replacement. I'm Brian Esser from How to Automotive. I'm going to walk you step by step through the process of changing out the rear wheel bearing and hub. Before we get started, I wanted to show you the wheel bearing and hub assembly. I will link this up in the description of the video, along with the tools. If you need any of those links will be in the description. We're going to get started by getting the rear of the vehicle off the ground. If you're doing this at home, use floor jacks and jack stands. I like to have the suspension hanging. Then you can go ahead and remove whatever wheel, the left or the right side, you're working on. If you don't have impact tools like this, you want to loosen the wheels up before you lift it off the ground. So loosen the lug nuts and then you can spin them off once it's off the ground. Now we're going to work on getting the brake caliper off. We're going to take the two 14mm bolts off here on the caliper. I'm using a ratcheting wrench. You can use a regular ratchet. If you have power tools, there's plenty of room to get those in here. So go ahead and crack these two bolts free and take those out. Once you got the two caliper bolts removed, go ahead and pull the caliper off just straight out towards you like this. And now we're just going to rest it up here on top of the suspension. We don't want it hanging from the hose. Now we're going to unbolt the brake caliper bracket here, or what they call the carrier. So we're going to take the two bolts out. They're 15mm, so we're going to take the top and bottom one out. I'm using a ratcheting wrench to do this too, but you can use regular sockets and ratchets, and also if there's plenty of room to get like an air ratchet in here if you need to. I'll link these wrenches up in the description of the video. They happen to be my favorite pair of wrenches that I own. I use them all the time. They're about 18 inches long. So you get lots of leverage with these. It's worth checking out. I'll link it up in the description. So once you get the two bolts removed, now you're just going to take the bracket and slide it off. So now if you're lucky, your rotor will slide off without any trouble. But this one's sticking a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a hammer and I'm going to strike it on the face of the rotor here. I'm going to be careful not to hit the lug studs. So hit it a few times and you see it pop free right there. You may have to unadjust the park brake. There's a little hole that you can adjust it through if it's really stuck. That's a little clip of me adjusting the brakes a little later on in the video, but that's the point. You can adjust them, back them off a little bit to get the rotor off if it's stuck. So right here I'm spinning the old bearing here. You can hear how scratchy it is. Now looking from the back side of the wheel, we're going to take the ABS sensor off. You're going to need a T30 Torx socket to remove the bolt. So you're going to take this bolt, the center bolt out right here. Now I live in Southern California and pretty much all these bolts are rust free or corrosion free. If you live anywhere where there's salt and snow, you may want to spray this down with some penetrating oil before you tackle this portion. Once you get it unbolted, you should be able to just pull the sensor out like this, and we're just going to let it hang over here off to the side. Now to get the bolts holding the bearing on, you're going to need a T60 Torx bit like this. This one's a 1/2-inch drive one. I'll leave a link for it in the description of the video. So with a T60 bit, and I'm using probably about an 8-inch extension here, I'm going to use my 1/2-inch drive ratchet here and crack the 4 bolts free. Once I loosen up all the fasteners by hand, then I'll switch over to a power tool and remove them. I don't like using the power tool from the get-go. That initial, when you initially try to break them free, it's a good chance you'll strip them out or round them out. So once I've loosened them up by hand, then I'll switch over to a power tool and I'll run them the rest of the way out, make it a little bit faster. So once you get the 4 bolts removed, now you can come on this side and go ahead and pull the bearing off. Your backing plate's most likely going to come off with it. So you're just going to separate the bearing from the backing plate like this, and then you go ahead and put the backing plate back onto the hub. To get the backing plate to stay on, I needed to pull the bolts through like this so they're all sticking out. Now I can hang the backing plate on there. I'm also going to put a little bit of red thread locker on these bolts before I bolt the bearing back up to it. This will prevent those from vibrating loose and coming back off. Now that the bolts are prepped, I'm going to go ahead and put the backing plate back on. So I got the studs pulled through, and I'll just set this on here. I also reached through the backing plate here and pulled the bolts through like this. Now we're going to mount the wheel bearing. You want the ABS sensor facing upwards at the top. So you'll slide it into position, and then you'll reach around the back side and you'll start the 4 bolts. I recommend starting all the bolts by hand before you start running them down and tightening them up. When you're snugging the bearings up, you don't want to make sure it doesn't cock off to one side as possible. Make sure it draws in evenly. Then you can hook up your torque wrench and you can torque these down in a kind of a crisscross pattern, and you torque them down to 98 foot-pounds. So when I'm torquing these fasteners down, I support the socket and extension with one hand, and I use my other hand to pull on the torque wrench. I'm pulling it down with even pressure. I'm not jerking the torque wrench. That gives us a nice even torque. Now that the wheel bearing is torqued, we can go ahead and install the ABS sensor. You'll just slide it in the hole that's in the back of the bearing, and then you'll start the T30 Torx bolt and tighten that up. So when I tighten these up, I just run them in until they're snug, and then give it about a quarter turn. I tried looking up the torque spec for it, I couldn't locate it. So I just ran it into a snug and about a quarter turn more, and that's good enough. Now we're going to reinstall the rotor. I'm putting on new ones, so I'm going to have to adjust my park brake here. So this little star wheel here will adjust it either in or out to tighten it up. The way you do that is you line up this hole here. It fits, actually, it doesn't really matter which way you put it on. So you'll slide the rotor on. So you're going to check the adjustment by rotating it side to side. If it needs to be adjusted, you'll adjust it through this little hole on that little star wheel. And you adjust it up until it just barely snug or barely drags in the inside of the rotor here. You'll feel it. So this one was pretty far out, so I had to adjust it up pretty good. I actually may have been going the wrong way. So if you're going the wrong way, you just adjust the other way until you can adjust it up till it stops, and then back it off a few threads. So once you got it adjusted the way you like it, there's a little rubber plug that you can install on the hole here. If you're installing new rotors, you'll have to retrieve it from your old rotor. Go ahead and put that plug back in after you got it adjusted. It just presses in. So while we're in here, I decided to go ahead and change out the brake pads. If you're not, you're going to just slide it back on and bolt it up. But to change out the pads, I'm going to make sure that all these slides here are lubed up and moving freely. So I took them off, and I'm going to put a little bit of Seal Glide, which is a silicone-based grease, on here. I'll wipe all this old grease out. And once I did that, I'm going to change out the metal hardware here, the stainless steel hardware. So I'll pop that off and put the new ones. Then I'll put a little bit of blue thread locker on all the bolts. This will prevent these from vibrating loose and backing back off. Now we're pretty much prepped, so I'll slide the caliper bracket over the rotor. And once I slide it over the rotor, I'll start the two main bolts, the 15 millimeters, by hand. Once those are run in until they're snug, then we can switch over to a torque wrench and torque them down to 41 foot-pounds. Now we can take the inner and outer brake pad and go ahead and slide those into position. So you'll line them up with the little tabs on here, and you'll press them in until they're fitting flush on against the rotor. When you slide these pads in, you also want to make sure that they slide in nice and easily and not binding in any way. Now that the brake pads are mounted, I'm going to take a little bit of Seal Glide brake grease, which is a silicone brake grease, and apply a thin layer on the back of the shims here. And this will help prevent squeaks and vibrations. Now, if you're doing this without replacing the brake pads, you can go ahead and slide the caliper back on. I'm changing the brake pad, so I need to press the pistons back in. So what I'm using is this caulking gun type tool that presses the pistons back in by squeezing the handle. Once the piston is fully seated into the bore of the caliper, now we're going to make sure that the brake hose is not twisted in any way, and then we'll slide the caliper over the new brake pads, and we'll start the two bolts, the top and bottom. So I started both of these bolts down by hand. They have the blue thread locker on there, and now I'm going to torque them down to 19 foot-pounds. Once I had the two caliper bolts torqued down, then I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the wheel. So I'll install the wheel. I'll start all these lug nuts by hand. I'll run them in until they're snug, and then I'm going to show you how we torque them down here in a second. So I'm going to run them down with my impact there. I'm not tightening them up with it. I'm just running them down until they're snug, until they bottom out, and then we'll switch over to a torque wrench. So now that the lug nuts are snugged up, I'm going to lower the wheel down to the ground, and I'm going to finish torquing them down to 100 foot-pounds in a star pattern. Now that the wheel's torqued down, we're going to pump the brake pedal a few times, and this is going to pump the fluid back into the caliper. When we compressed it earlier, the fluid will go back up into the master cylinder. So now we need to make sure it's top it all off. I will link up all the parts and tools that I use in this video in the description. I'm Brian Esser from How To Automotive. I'd like to thank you guys for watching, encourage you to subscribe, invite you to head over to the howtoautomotive.com website for more valuable videos like this. Thank you again for watching.